Two questions have always been on my mind. The first one being whether or not Zoro will ever get his own sword forged for him. And the second one being why so far in Wano, this legendary country of swordsmen and swordsmiths, we have not yet seen a supreme grade blade. Well, maybe the answer to both those questions are somehow connected. What's good, everybody? Hope you're all doing well. As you can see behind me, my setup is finally somewhat fully complete. So we're back on the grind making some videos, and today we're gonna have a very fun discussion on whether or not Zoro's gonna get his own sword. We're gonna start off by breaking down some information on supreme grade swords and Zoro's current swords, talk about what other swords could potentially replace his current swords, and with all that information we'll talk about whether or not it makes sense for him to get his own sword. As always, if you like content like this, make sure you subscribe and join our King Pirates crew. We're getting very close to 60,000. And of course, if you have a good time watching this video, please drop a like for the YouTube algorithm. Alright, but to start things off, let's start off by talking about the three swords Zoro already has: the Wado Ichimonji, Enma, and the Sandai Kitetsu. Because as it stands right now, Zoro does not technically need any other swords. He already has three. The first one I want to talk about is the Wado Ichimonji, the OG sword for Zoro. It has this beautiful white hilt, and it's the sword that he's had ever since the beginning of the story. And it's also a sword that is very important to him because it's a sword he inherited from Kuena. Of course, he did so in order to carry on her will and become the world's strongest swordsman for both of them. And because of that, the Wado Ichimonji is not a sword I see Zoro ever getting rid of. Because not only does it have a lot of sentimental value and is very important to Zoro, but it's also a pretty damn good sword with a lot of lore behind it as well. First off, in terms of just sword ranking, it is a great sword, the second highest tier of swords. There's only 21 of them in the world, so it's a very rare sword. So just by quality alone, it's already superb, but on top of that, it also has some connections to Wano. And that's because the person that created this sword was Shimotsuki Kozaburo. He was a person that also created another one of Zoro's swords, Enma, that we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, as we found out from Hitetsu, the Wado Ichimonji was crafted by Shimotsuki Kozaburo. On top of that, Oda fleshed out this information a while back in the SBS, where we found out Kozaburo had left Wano 55 years ago and founded the Shimotsuki village, and it turns out he's actually Kuena's grandfather. So altogether, the Wado Ichimonji is just a very important sword. Not only does it have connections back to Wano, but it's also very important to Zoro, and it's a damn good sword. So for those reasons, it's pretty unlikely that Zoro ends up getting rid of that sword at any point. In fact, whenever I talk about the idea of Zoro getting his own sword, a lot of people will point to the Wado Ichimonji as already being Zoro's sword, which I do think is a good argument because he did inherit that sword, and I don't see him getting rid of that sword, at least until he becomes the world's strongest swordsman. But at the same time, I don't think Zoro keeping the Wado Ichimonji fully stops him from getting his own sword. I think it would still be really dope for him to get his own sword to create his own history with, and because of the fact that he uses three swords, there's two other swords that could be easily replaced with his own. So let's talk about another one of his current swords, Enma, that was also created by Shimotsuki Kozaburo. And when it comes to Enma, it really is a one-of-a-kind sword that we've never seen in this story before. In terms of sword grade, is also a great grade blade, so it should be similar to the Wado Ichimonji, but nope, it could also suck out your haki. That's right, Enma for some reason has the ability to draw out the user's haki without their control. It's the only sword we've seen in the story that has any type of special abilities like that, so it is a very special sword just because of those abilities alone, which does make it a good candidate for a sword that Zoro ends up keeping. So far in Wano, it's by far the sword that Zoro has used the most and it has been emphasized the most, and plus there's the fact that it was also created by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, making it a nice pair with the Wado Ichimonji. At the same time though, while all of these are good reasons why Zoro would keep this sword, I don't feel like any of them are like strong reasons for him to keep that sword forever. In fact, the only strong argument that I see was a line that was mentioned by Hitetsu, in which she mentioned to Zoro that Enma could be turned into a black blade which will raise its rank. To me, that was one of the most important lines in regards to Enma because it was about something that Zoro would do with the blade in the future. Plus, Hitetsu not only talked about turning it into a black blade, but also raising its rank, which would make it a supreme grade blade. And if Zoro's able to do that in the future along with Enma's special abilities, it feels like a sword that Zoro has to keep. At the same time, I will say it's still a little unclear whether or not raising the rank means the sword grade, so it's entirely possible that that's not what Hitetsu meant and Enma can't become a supreme grade. And if that's the case and Enma remains a great blade, I don't feel like it's a sword that Zoro has to keep. And I think it's entirely possible that that conversation with Hitetsu was merely using Enma as an example for what's to happen in the future with another sword. Say for example, Zoro turning the Wado Ichimonji black, which I'm sure he will do. The Hitetsu conversation could simply be delivering information and foreshadowing for that. So overall, when it comes to Enma, while I think there are good reasons why he would keep this sword, I don't think he absolutely has to keep it. At the end of the day, I don't think he has that strong of an attachment to it, and it is supposed to be Hiyori's sword. The Oden connection was one that I never felt like was very strong. Like sure, in a way, Zoro is carrying on Oden's will by using Enma here to defeat Kaido and the Beast Pirates. But at the same time, it's not like Zoro has any direct connections to Oden, and many other people like Yamato and the Scabbards are also carrying on Oden's will. So I think if Zoro's given a good replacement sword, he will absolutely let go and give back Enma. So with Enma, I don't think it's a surefire keeper, but there's one more sword that I think is even more likely to get replaced, and that is the Sandai Kitetsu. Don't get me wrong, I do like the Sandai Kitetsu. I think it's a dope looking sword and it has a good story behind it, being a cursed blade. It's also another sword that Zoro has had for a very long time, ever since back in Loketown, but at this point its sword ranking just feels a little out of place. You see, both the Wado Ichimonji and Enma, while they're not supreme grade blades, they're just one level lower as great grade blades. But one level below the great grade blades, you have the skillful grade blades, which there are 50 of, so they're a little less rare, but definitely still unique. But the Sandai Kitetsu is not even a skillful grade blade, it's one level below that. It's straight up just called a great sword, and there's not a specific number to them, so they're not that unique. The only other sword that we know that is in the same grade is Tashigi Shigure, and that's how you know Zoro has to move on from this sword. He cannot be seen walking around with a Tashigi level sword. So out of all of Zoro's current swords, I definitely think the Sandai is easily the most replaceable, but at the same time, it might not get replaced by a sword forged for Zoro because there are other blades that Zoro could take on. And when it comes to these swords, the first options we have to discuss are the other Kitetsu blades, because besides the Sandai Kitetsu, there are two other Kitetsu blades that are much better. First off, we have the Nidai Kitetsu, which is already in Wano, making it a very likely candidate to replace one of Zoro's swords. In terms of its sword rank, it's also a great sword, the same level as Zoro's other two swords, and it's also a sword that Zoro has shown interest in when he saw Luffy using it, and Oda even kind of teased us with it by having Luffy refuse to give Zoro the sword, so you could see that along with all the other emphasis placed on the Nidai as foreshadowing for Zoro getting this sword. And to be honest, I do think there's a very good chance that Zoro does end up getting the Nidai. It feels like the perfect upgrade from the Sandai Kitetsu. Is also a cursed blade, but just better rank. Of course, Oda has placed a little bit of emphasis on it. I doubt he would just do that to show us, hey, here's the Nidai Kitetsu, but nothing's gonna happen to it. In terms of why he would replace the Sandai, it could either be the Sandai breaking or him just upgrading. For a while, I did think there's a good chance that the Sandai might break when Zoro's like fighting Kaido or something, but as things are in the manga, it doesn't seem likely that the Sandai is gonna break, but there's still plenty of ways to create a reason for Zoro to get this sword. It could be as simple as Hitetsu giving Zoro the Nidai and saying, hey, I want my Sandai Kitetsu back because he did make that blade, and then instead he'll give him the Nidai knowing it's a stronger blade and that Zoro deserves it for saving Wano. So honestly, I think judging off of what we've seen so far, Zoro getting the Nidai is a very strong possibility, but at the same time, the existence of the Shodai Kitetsu makes things a lot more interesting, because if Zoro upgrades from the Sandai to the Nidai, I feel like he has to upgrade to the Shodai eventually. Not only is the Shodai a better blade as a supreme grade blade, but also it would just kind of feel a little unsatisfying if he just stopped at the Nidai and kept the Nidai. So in my opinion, even if Zoro gets the Nidai, it's only a stepping stone for him to get the Shodai, which might end up creating a situation that feels a little forced because you will need to create another reason for Zoro to replace the Nidai with the Shodai. I do think there's a very clear path for Oda to do that, especially because most likely the Shodai Kitetsu is with one of the Gorosei. Although it hasn't been confirmed by Oda, the sword that one of the Gorosei is holding is most likely the Shodai Kitetsu, and that's because the sword has the same designs as the other Kitetsu blades. So if Oda wants to create a situation where Zoro eventually gets the Shodai, he can easily do that because the Straw Hats are definitely gonna fight the world government eventually. So out of the Kitetsu blades, I actually think the Shodai Kitetsu is more likely to be one of Zoro's final swords, but I also don't think it's impossible that Zoro doesn't get the Nidai or the Shodai and instead gets his own sword to replace the Sandai. Because although it's likely that Zoro just gets the Nidai and then eventually upgrades to the Shodai, it does feel a little predictable. So I think it's entirely possible that Oda goes a different direction. Maybe Hitetsu thinks the Kitetsu blades are too dangerous and just wants Zoro to recollect them. So that way eventually Zoro still has that altercation with the Gorosei and could get the Shodai Kitetsu, and instead maybe Hitetsu creates a new blade just for Zoro. I know with this scenario, my bias is definitely coming through in that I do want to see Zoro get his own sword. I do think Zoro upgrading the Kitetsu feels a little obvious, so Oda could change things up. Now lastly, before I talk about the possibility of Zoro getting his own sword, I'm gonna quickly touch on Shusui because a lot of people always comment that, and for me personally, I just feel like Shusui's time is done as Zoro's sword. It was incredibly important that that sword gets returned to the grave of Ryuma, and even though Zoro might end up having some sort of lineage connections to Ryuma, I don't think they're gonna just like dig the sword back out and give it to Zoro. That would be kind of weird. So in terms of other swords that Zoro can inherit, I do think the Kitetsus are the best chance. That being said, let's get to the final question of how likely is it that Zoro's gonna get his own sword? And to be honest with you guys, if I had to really bet on it, I would probably say it's not that likely he actually gets his own sword. First off, with the Wado Ichimonji, you could technically just consider that his sword because he is carrying on the will of Kuena. But even if you don't consider that his sword, I really don't think he's ever gonna get rid of that sword. If anything, maybe at like the end of the story where he's like older and like accomplished everything, he returns that sword to her grave and just like has a nice talk saying like, hey, look, we did it. But until then, I don't see him parting with the sword anytime soon. So that leaves us with only 2 spots left. And if I had to bet on what those 2 final swords would be, I would probably still bet on the Shodai Kitetsu and Enma. Enma, as I mentioned earlier, I'm still not completely confident that Zoro has to keep that sword. But as we're seeing these battles play out in the manga, it is a sword that he is heavily relying on. And through these battles, he's not only developed a stronger understanding of it, but also it feels like a stronger connection. But like I said, I could definitely still see it getting replaced. And if I had to choose between the Wado, Shodai, or Enma getting replaced, I would probably pick Enma. It is an incredibly unique sword with its special abilities of drawing out your haki, but I don't really like seeing that power used all the time. I know that once Zoro has full control of Enma, he's just gonna use it like any other sword, and at the end of the day, it's still Zoro's haki that's being used, so it's not like boosting his power or anything. But in a way, I do feel the same way about Enma as I did Sanji's raid suit. Like, both of these things were cool introductions, but they don't feel like long-term things that these characters should have. Instead, they almost feel like short-term training mechanisms and power-ups. So honestly, I would not mind if Zoro replaced Enma by the end of Wano with his own blade, so that way he's not always carrying around this one-of-a-kind blade that sucks out your own haki, and instead he kind of just used it in this arc to really train himself. But yeah, that being said though, I still think there's a good chance that he does end up keeping Enma, but if I had to pick one blade to replace with Zoro's own sword, it would definitely be Enma, because the Shodai Kitetsu on the other hand, I feel like is a lot more fitting for a final sword. Not only is it of the highest quality as a supreme grade blade, but it's also a curse blade and a Kitetsu blade that Zoro has always had in his arsenal. And as much as I think the Sandai should be replaced with a better sword, I do think it's very iconic to Zoro and it's very fitting to his character. On top of that, the Shodai Kitetsu is the only supreme grade blade that is from Wano that we know of so far. So with that being the case, and also Zoro possibly having lineage connections to Wano, I think it would make sense for him to have the Shodai Kitetsu as well. So honestly, the Shodai Kitetsu is a blade I actually really want to see Zoro get as one of his final swords. If I could make it into my own headcanon, I would say Zoro keeps the Wado and gets the Shodai and turns both of them into supreme grade black blades. And then his third and final sword is one carefully crafted and forged just for him. And it doesn't even have to be a supreme grade blade right away. Maybe it's just a great grade that he turns into another supreme grade black blade. So in the end, he can have 3 supreme grade black blades, one to represent Kuena, one to represent Wano, and one to represent himself. Now, of course, those are just my thoughts in my headcanon. I definitely want to hear your thoughts, so comment below. Get yourself some One Piece manga with the link in the description. And in my hand, I'm holding out a bounty poster that is either Shanks, Boa, or Ace. If you guess it wrong, you have to like, subscribe, and watch the next video. The answer is the red-haired man.